And could you just expand upon what you mean by you're a nativist? Like, how do you define nativism in your context? Is it like you're born with innate capacities to learn language, or you're born with specific languages in mind or concepts?
Well, no one is born with any specific language in mind, right? No
Mm-hmm.
one's born knowing English because that would be a silly theory, right? Right. Languages grow and change all the time, and there is no I mean, there is no specific human language that anybody is born knowing. What you are born knowing is you have a set of innate biases that um, guide you to learn language. I think some of those biases are in fact semantic, right? So some of the biases are probably, like I say, just computational, just about how the human mind crunches data, right? So what you do as a baby, you go out in the world and you sit around and stuff comes into your brain. You hear language, or if you're deaf, you see it with your people's fingers. You get all this input, and your mind processes it. You don't do this consciously. I mean, your average 6-month-old is not contemplating the question of what are the phonological distinctions within my language and which ones are most important for determining whether this is a word or simply a variant of pronunciation, right? No one, I mean, adults don't do this consciously. So apparently what happens is the brain takes this information and it crunches the numbers, right? And so there's a learning mechanism that can crunch the numbers. And you could say that that is some kind of, say generic capacity, but the thing is, everybody ends up crunching the numbers pretty similarly. So we all have whatever this capacity is. It's prepared to take this input, and it's prepared to manipulate it in particular ways and come to certain kinds of conclusions. So I mean, it's like you got a macro on your computer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're dumping a data file into the macro, and it's like, I got you. Let me see what I've got a series of computations. Let's see what pops out when I do that. That's I'm interested in what that macro is. What's the, what does it take in, and what does it spit out based on what goes in? Um, I think that you have a series of these kinds of macros that are sort of like in your mind, that are like processing, chunking along with the data. I actually think that some of these also are semantically oriented. So I think there are some concepts that you are um, expecting that help you organize what you're looking at, that are in linguistically they are like pieces that you're looking for. Like you have a macro that says, I think that you're going to have something that's going to be like telling you who did what to whom, right? That's how languages work, people. Something is going to tell you who did this. So give me info, and I'll figure out how your language tells you who did what to whom. Languages do that in different kinds of ways, but all languages can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that just means that there's something, and like I say, whether that sort of fundamental thing that you're working on is truly just about language or whether you can apply it to other kinds of things, I'm slightly agnostic on that one. I'm prepared to believe that it's a piece of cognition, that this is something you care about in your representation of events and your representation outside of language as well. But I do think it's innate that you're born wanting to know that piece of information and expecting to find it, and expecting people to be communicating it to you, and expecting it to correspond to things in the world. So you're not like you don't have to guess about whether or not you care about who did what to. You always do.
Mm-hmm.
And you think that people always do, and you think that's being communicated to you, and you expect it to be a fundamental piece of how they're going to structure their communication to you.
Okay.
So it's abstract.
Okay. And so you said there's some linguists who are not nativists, right? So they're more
Sure.
empiricists. What's the best argument for language processing being like not imperial, but not nativist?
I mean, like I say, depends how far down this rabbit hole you want to go, right? I mean, so everybody's at least a tiny bit of a nativist, in the sense that you can't teach a dog to do all of it, right? And if you could, then it wouldn't just be the human mind that could do this, be other animals. But there are, for instance, people who genuinely believe that it is fundamentally driven by your input and your social skills, right? So this is, they are driven to, for instance, try to teach chimpanzees how to talk. Like, just give a chimp the right environment, right? That what makes a human special is not that we have a special human brain, it's that we create special human environments. And so we put a chimp in that environment, they will learn language. This turns out not to be true. It's been tried. Um, so not. Um, but it is the thing is, there is variability in the process, right? So there's a lot of people have this idea that universal grammar has to be some kind of like like super rigid thing. And in some cases, like I say, there are some pretty strong trajectories that happen. But like my language is not identical to my brother's language, even though we were raised in the same household. Um, Everybody has to create their linguistic system for themselves. And the fact that there is this creation process and there is this learning process opens up this whole world where the environment matters. And for some people, that's a question of focusing on what's there in the environment. I will also say computationally, this is where like, big advances in computer science have changed the debate a little bit. So, I mean, if you are sort of a non-nativist, you still believe you have a human mind. You just believe that you're using an all-purpose general learning device that learns anything, has generic properties. It could learn how to tie. Same thing that helps you learn how to tie your shoes is the thing that helps you learn how to learn language. There's no specific macros that do this. It's just generic. And it used to be that was like wholly preposterous that you would ever say such a thing. But computationally now, you can do a lot more with a neural net that starts with very shallow structures at the beginning, and they can learn to create deeper structures. I mean, this is something that the computer scientists are all into these days. So it's a more compelling argument than it used to be, that you could start with something that actually wasn't very language specific, but could learn how to become language specific through input. Like maybe you build your own macros. To my mind, I'm not sure it matters all that much. I mean, I sort of feel like there's enough structure there at the beginning that everybody gets pushed pretty close to the same place. And that's the structure that I think is innate. Not all of it, but enough of it.
Okay, and just like a last question on that, wouldn't like specific language deficits like Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia kind of be like a huge counter argument to the same thing that makes you learn how to tie your shoes is the same thing that makes you learn language?
Yeah, yes and no, except that you don't get that with kids, right? So what happens with adult, and no one, even if you're on the empiricist side, is going to be particularly bothered by the idea that over a lifetime of learning, you develop specialized brain structures. You have them for reading also, right? So I can knock out. I mean, you get the right brain damage, and you can lose the capacity to read, but not your capacity for language. And no one thinks reading is innate. Like I don't think reading is innate. Reading is clearly a learned skill. I mean, it's a relatively late human development. So we do know that with expertise and time and effort, whatever, a lifetime of lived experience, your brain will develop specialized circuitry. So the fact that Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia happen, it's just a way of saying, yeah, okay, so there's specialized circuitry that you have developed as an adult. People will also point out that some of that specialized circuitry, like in the left hemisphere, seems to do all kinds of rapid serial processing. So maybe what we're looking at is the brain has a rapid serial processing mechanism.
Okay.
Great. Language is a rapid piece of rapid, you have to process it rapidly and serially. So maybe that's what you're looking at is the rapid serial processor, and it develops in specialized circuitry. If I'm an feeling empiricist, I would point out that like there's some interesting cases of very, very young children, infants, who get hydroencephaly and like say lose their left hemisphere functionally. They don't actually get completely ruled out of language. These kids can actually develop shocking amounts of language. Depending on who you ask, maybe they can get it all. So there seems to be a capacity that the human brain has to, whatever, reassess and rewire and take it over and do it differently. And if that's the case, that's an interesting argument that, well, it isn't like we're not phrenologists, right? It's not like there's just like one piece of the brain and all like language acquisition device sits in this piece of the brain. If you lose that piece of the brain, you are gone. It can't be like that because these hydroencephaly kids suggest that whatever it is, it's got to be something that's a little bit more general than that, or you can rebuild it, or it's based in some kind of other circuitry, or it's in the software, not the hardware. It's clearly more complicated than just saying it's like, it's not your eyeball, for instance. Take the eyeball out, you don't have the eyeball. Language acquisition device is not an eyeball.
Right.